So thank you very much. So we started some time ago in 1848 with the opening of St Augustine's College in Canterbury. I want to fast forward nearly 30 years to the 25th of April 1876, St Mark's Day, which saw the consecration of the chapel of Keble, 25th of April 1876. A consecration that was marked by no fewer than 2 sermons, 3 religious services, half a dozen speeches, and an offertory collection of £853. Now, I'm conscious that I have about 10 minutes in which to do this, so I don't attempt to try and do all of that now. But what I do want to do is to focus on the chapel itself as a way of summing up and drawing together much of what we've learnt here today, summing up some of the things we've learned, but also trying to relate them to wider and bigger histories. The histories not just of Keble, not just of Oxford, not just of higher education or the Church of England, or even just of England, but also a wider world history, a history that can be traced in the buildings that we see today and in the college that we celebrate today. Now, I'm afraid it's fair to say that not everyone wholly approved of the structure of the chapel. We've already heard that Butterfield came to regret his use of bricks. The Building News, one of the preeminent journals of the age, which published it here, described it as a holy zebra. The World, another publication of the period, simply dismissed, and I quote, its unspeakable ugliness. The Hour, a high church magazine, observed that it was, and again I quote, externally a hideous building, vividly suggestive of a workhouse or a county lunatic asylum. Notably, in his sermon at the opening of the chapel, Keble's friend and fellow tractarian Edward Pusey utterly failed to mention the building at all in his hour-long sermon. He had hoped for a nice stone structure and not the bricky building which eventuated. At my own college, at St John's, as you know, the reaction was rather more than mere silence. The college had sold the site, handsome terms, on condition, well, 2 conditions. The college made Keble promise that on the one hand, nothing the college did would drag down property prices. On the other hand, that nothing the college did would be hostile to the established church. It's a very St John's response to have that order of priorities in the conditions. It was a good deal for St John's, and indeed the president of the college attended the opening of the chapel in 1876. The students, of course, were frankly horrified by what they saw. And long into the 20th century, as you know, St John's had a Destroy Keble Society, which would induct members by the removal of a brick. And it's the Destroy Keble Society, as you know, which then inspires this response from the students of Keble to the avaricious students of St John's. But doubts aside, it has to be said that it was a marvellous day, the day that the chapel was consecrated, a day of real celebration, a day marked not only by a lot of talking, but a lot of eating, and by half a dozen bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Chancellor, Lord Salisbury, half of Oxford, a third of the Cabinet, and much of the House of Lords gathered in this place, or just across the road, to mark the occasion. But this wasn't just an exciting time for Keble or for Oxford. It can be understood, it was understood by many contemporaries and by still more historians. 1876 or thereabouts can be understood as the apogee of Britain's world power. 1876, the year the chapel opened, was also the year, indeed April was the month in which Victoria became Empress of India. Britain was, in 1876, still the single largest industrial nation, trading nation, commercial nation, imperial nation, and the statistics speak for themselves. Now, these 2 events, one highly local, the other hugely, expansively international, are worth thinking about further, and Keble, I'd suggest, helps us to do that. Indeed, Keble Chapel can be seen as the focus, a meeting point for many different scales of history, from the subjective and personal to the truly international. As a building, as a project, as an idea, and as an influence, exemplifies the value of thinking about these different scales, of thinking how different scales of analysis help us to understand Keble's place in the world and the world's place in Keble. At the most detailed scale, we might start with the building itself. Keble Chapel is an Oxford icon, of course, and a vision of a very particular Oxford. It's a product, as we know, as we've heard today, of the Oxford movement, of that campaign to reform the university and revive the Catholic traditions and ethos of the Church of England. But the chapel is an Oxford product in more ways than that narrow party label might suggest. Its location and its form places it not just within the university or city generally, but within the immediate locality, within North Oxford, part of what the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins famously called the base and brackish skirt that Oxford had acquired through the 19th century. Keeble was built on the site of a market garden, one of many market gardens. Here's a lovely image from the local archives of Parks Road before Keeble was built. It was a market garden, as Earl Beecham observed, at the opening of the chapel, with currant trees and gooseberry bushes stretched across the site of the college. It was the arrival of the college in this place was just a small part of the wider transformation of northern Oxford from small-scale, small-holding agricultural land into urban sprawl, or suburban sprawl, I suppose. This links Keeble to a profound change in the city, the transformation of Oxford from the small, grey university town of the 18th century to the large brick and yellow sandstone city that we see today. The exhaustion of local Headington stone, the arrival of the canal in the 1790s and of the railway in the 1850s, the abolition of the brick tax, all of this reshaped the local scale. The number of Oxford brick makers increased by 147% in the decade between 1861 and 1871. By 1881, Oxford had gained 83 brick-making yards in Cowley, in Headington, in Shotover, in Summertown. They were building this sort of stuff. The bricks were still handmade, but they utilised the newest sorts of industrial kilns to achieve the finish, colour and precision that left visitors, in the words of the Building News, gazing on Keble Chapel, quote, with much curiosity, if comparatively little hope. Keble's form and Keble's function was also the product of a distinctively Oxonian culture. This can be seen in the way that the college echoes other colleges and in the way that it challenges them. Brick, that, I can tell you exactly where that is. So that's St Philip and St James, the Church of St Philip and James. That's the Woodstock Road there. Brick, used at Keble, was a challenge to the indigenous university tradition, one that spoke of how Keble would be different. It also spoke of how it would be economical. It would not be luxurious. It would not be expensive. It would be, as Beecham put it, and I quote, an institution in which undergraduates should be able to live without being exposed to these temptations to extravagance and expense which undoubtedly exist in older foundations. Keble would be, in other words, Oxford, but better than Oxford. Unlike other colleges, the students would all live on site. They would all, as we just heard, eat in hall. The hall and the main quadrangle would thus be bigger than those of Christ Church. The plan, a series of open quadrangles with the chapel, the largest and most important structure, symbolised a reformed and explicitly Christian college, in contrast to the enclosed, inward-looking other colleges where chapel and hall were jammed together in a single range. Keble's location in its design also linked the college to the rich religious geography, not just of Oxford, but specifically again of North Oxford, of a world of convents, churches, the women's colleges like LMH that we heard about earlier, founded as a sort of Keble for women. North Oxford was, as the vicar of St Philip and St James observed in the middle of the 19th century, a strikingly churchy, even high church environment. And it was one that Keble suited well. Keble belonged, in other words, to this local scale, but it was again also distinguished from it. North Oxford was overwhelmingly female. As Keble was being built, census figures showed that 75% or more of the population of North Oxford was female. In 1891 or thereabouts, a woman went into Blackwell's and asked for a map of Oxford and was handed one of North Oxford. She was told, you won't need one of the centre. We have only maps of Oxford, they said. You, as a woman, you will only want the suburbs. So little wonder that Keble's architecture should speak of rugged assertion, nor that from the first the college was keen to participate in sports, which the first chaplain even preached on. He preached in the first term of the college's foundation on the need for better rowing after evensong on a Sunday. Keble needed to assert its place within the more masculine world of the university, although it was on the boundaries of all these women's colleges. It needed to assert its place as part of a world of bachelor dons, the world of Parsons' Pleasure, here in an image of 1906, and other homosocial activities, the activities Jane Garnett's paper talked about. Keble's form and Keble's function is therefore inexplicable aside from these local contexts, the context of the University of Oxford and the context of North Oxford. But change the scale, alter the magnification, if you like, and we can see how Keble also shaped and was shaped by national as well as local events and themes. As a foundation, it was not only intended to reflect Oxonian preoccupations. Its backers, as Ian's paper showed, came from all over Britain. They were part of many overlapping and interconnected networks which were made visible at the opening of the chapel, in the gathering of the great and the good, the rich and the powerful, the national names, the ministers, the bishops, the peers. This variegated attendance in 1876 also speaks of Angus's paper, showing the ways in which religion and politics intermeshed in Keble's foundation, for there was a politics and a political economy here as well as an educational and religious impetus. The idea of a new and inexpensive Oxford College can be traced back to the 1840s, 20 years before Keble died, in 1846 to be precise, when both Gladstone and Pusey and others supported an address on university extension. Within 3 years, those people had raised £3,000. Land had been leased to build this new college, land which would later form the site of Keble College. As we've heard, it was that plan which was revived in 1866, the year that Keble died, but much of the real impetus for university extension came 2 years later with the Second Reform Act. The sudden expansion of the electorate, the leap in the dark as it was called, enfranchised a new and, it was believed, alarmingly ill-educated public. The Education Act of 1870, which created universal elementary education, is rightly understood as a response to the anxiety engendered by this new and ill-educated set of voters. But there was also a response directed at and for the middle and upper classes. At Bristol in 1874, 2 years before the chapel at Keble is consecrated, the foundation of a new university was heralded by one of its chief backers in precisely those terms. The Liberal MP Samuel Morley, attending the opening of the Bristol University College, observed, "It is for us, the middle class, to resolve that we will, instead of falling into the back rank, maintain our position of influence in this country. This we can only do by promoting the culture and intellectual advancement of our sons and our daughters." And Keble and Girton and the other institutions we've been talking about today are part of that middle class movement. At the national scale, we can also link this building to the forest of new churches and chapels created by the Victorians. By the time Keble acquired its chapel, the Church of England had built 3,000 or 4,000 other churches. In the decade before it opened, a new Anglican church was opened every 3 or 4 days. That's how much this is part of a broader movement. This reflected religious revival, of course. It also reflected, as I've tried to argue in other places, a new understanding of church architecture, a sense which would be expressed very powerfully in Keble Chapel, that builders were no longer just the containers of religious worship, but missionaries in their own right. An ideal expressed in the architect William Butterfield's declaration that this chapel was less a building than a literal embodiment of Christian doctrine, with its ornamentation intended, and this is Butterfield writing, as a complete course in Christian history, and even its brickwork meant to convey theological principle. And I can talk about that endlessly, so I will just move on to an image of Rugby School and All Saints Margaret Street, where the same idea, as we heard earlier, is manifested. At this national scale, we can also see that Keble was impossible and its structural unimaginable without the wider changes that had transformed the country more generally. Although inspired by the medieval church, by medieval Christendom, Keble was a thoroughly modern building, complete with modern windows, central heating, sinks, cisterns, lofts, and as one journal put it, all other modern conveniences calculated to save trouble. It was built by modern contractors, national figures, not the local building trade, who used a steam winch and other mechanical building equipment to hoist materials up onto the roof of the chapel. Butterfield's greatest patron and fiercest critic, the MP Alexander Beresford Hope, so good he called himself twice, asked a critical question a decade before Keble Chapel was opened. Our public works and our public buildings, he wrote, become day to day more vast and more lofty. The giant hotel replaces the gloomy and obscure tavern. The public library throws into the shade the few hoarded volumes in the corner. The cramped stagecoach with its handful of squeezed travellers has been annihilated by the train with its hundreds of well-housed passengers. Shall God only be forgotten, he asked? Shall we be told we ought to make our homes and our town halls, our theatres and our hotels, our shops and our legislative chambers lofty and wide, glorious with painting and carved work, glittering with costly materials, and that the house of the Lord is allowed alone to remain small and mean? Well, the answer was obviously no. Change the scale again, however, alter our magnification, and other themes come into view. On an international scale, it would be very easy to link this building with the other great revivalist religious architecture of this period. As we heard, Butterfield owed his career in part to his work on St Augustine's College in Canterbury, designed to dispatch missionaries across the British Empire. Even as he was building Keble, so he was also overseeing the Anglican Cathedral in Melbourne. It's noteworthy, too, that the opening celebrations for the chapel in 1876 had a distinctly imperial timbre. The worthies assembled included the bishops of Petermaritzburg and the bishop designate of Bombay. Lord Salisbury's speech explicitly evoked his belief that the architecture evoked a wholesome frugality in living which was especially necessary for the late Victorians. As the nation grows in wealth, he opined, luxury advances with more than equal strides, and our fate seems likely to be too nearly that which attends the rise of many an Eastern dynasty. Keble, in other words, was a kind of counter-Orientalist redoubt. And Keble Chapel doesn't just evoke these narrowly imperial themes. As a foundation and as a work of architecture, it evokes and expresses the intermingling of ethics and aesthetics, religion and politics, modernity and historical revivalism that was similarly expressed in the Low Countries, in Germany, in Russia. One might almost say that the entire world is covering itself with the vegetation of churches in the style of the Middle Ages, observed the French Annales Archéologiques in 1853. Keeble, like the newly completed Cologne Cathedral, like the National Cathedral about to go up in Washington, even like the Cathedral of the Saviour on the Blood in St. Petersburg, speaks of an international movement of neo-Gothic or historic revivalist architecture, part then of a genuinely transnational trend. More tangibly, too, Keble Chapel would have been unthinkable without the overseas profits of its great benefactor, Thomas Gibbs, the donor whose thousands of pounds made it all possible. Another tractarian and an enthusiast for all things medieval, as his home, Tinsfield, still reveals. Gibbs was also an international businessman. Indeed, it's been suggested that Gibbs's fondness for High Church Anglicanism was the product of his decade spent living and worshipping in the Iberian Peninsula. It was, in other words, Spain, rather more than England, Seville, rather more than Oxford, that inspired his love of neo-medievalism and his support for Anglo-Catholicism. And it was South America, of course, that paid for it all. Famously, the Gibbs money came from guano, or as traders in London used to sing, the House of Gibbs, they made their dibs, selling the turds of foreign birds. This, though, was no means a laughing matter. In the improved experimental agricultural world of the mid-19th century, guano was seen as little more and little less than a miracle fertilizer. Thomas Gibbs owned the monopoly to the best guano in the world, fertilizer dug out of a set of islands just off Peru. And this is the guano deposit you can see here. The scale of the enterprise, as you see, is just extraordinary. In the 2 decades before 1876, guano was the single largest commodity extracted from the whole of South America. In the years between 1855 and 1864, Britain received cargoes of guano, most of it controlled by the Gibbs, worth £20 million in Victorian money. You can multiply that by 50 to get a sense of how much this is coming. And here are the ships leaving the guano islands with their commodity. Up to 700,000 tons of guano was imported to England each year, with the firm of Gibbs alone dispatching as many as 478 ships a year from the guano islands to carry home all this stuff. Not only did this pay for Keble Chapel, not only did this transform this little bit of Oxford, the guano trade and the Gibbs family transformed Peru as a result. The fertilizer business single-handedly sustained the Peruvian government. It paid for the abolition of slavery in Peru, for a 3% increase in wages. It encouraged, contrariwise, the importation of Chinese indentured workers. It underwrote the cost of wars with neighbouring states. Moreover, the Gibbs family became the single biggest backers of the Peruvian state, underwriting and providing loans which eventually reached a peak of £35 million by the time that Keble Chapel was built. Peru was dependent upon the people who were paying for Keble Chapel. The chapel, in that sense, on the global scale, is linked, fundamentally, irrevocably linked to the development of global capitalism. Another project for an international businessman, another project for the head of a firm, for Gibbs, who had projects in India and Turkey, Denmark, Brazil, China, as well as Spain, Portugal, Peru, and the United States. All these scales, thus, I hope I've shown, reveal different aspects of Keble and its chapel. All these different magnifications provide different focuses and allow us to see the place that's so familiar to us in different ways. And of course, I've not exhausted the range of themes we might explore. It's suggestive that some of those who attended the opening of the chapel in 1876 saw in it not an image of Oxford or of Britain or of the world more generally, but just an image of Keble himself, with the mosaics and stained glass seen somehow as an embodiment of the man and especially of his poetry. The way in which these different scales collide is also wonderfully exemplified by the reminiscences of one supporter at the laying of the college's foundation stone in 1868. George Selwyn, Bishop of Lichfield, and before that Bishop of New Zealand, was the inspiration of Keeble's sister college in Cambridge, another high church foundation designed to educate inexpensively in suitably religious, suitably red brick surrounding Selwyn College, of course. For Selwyn, who was there at the laying of the foundation stone, Keeble was a man and the college an institution which existed necessarily in many different scales. Keeble's poetry, Selwyn recalled, was something that came down like a blessing to him from England to the Antipodes. The college, Selwyn continued, would be a similar blessing for the poor men of Lichfield in his current diocese, as well as a blessing for the University of Oxford and for England as a whole. In that way, Selwyn, in a single speech, brought together the personal, the local, the national, and the global, and we can now see it built just across the road. Thank you very much.